The gavel hadn't fallen yet when my brother pointed at me across that courtroom and told 12 strangers I had spent 20 years inventing a military career to manipulate a dying man out of his fortune. He said it with the particular confidence of someone who has never been wrong in front of an audience and doesn't believe today will be the exception. I sat in a gray suit with nothing on my lapel that would tell anyone in that room who I actually was. No pins, no ribbons, nothing. That announced itself. I didn't flinch. I didn't reach for my attorney's arm. I simply watched Daniel's face and understood something he didn't yet understand about himself. He had built his entire case on the assumption that my silence was the same thing as having nothing to say. He was about to spend the rest of the trial learning otherwise. My name is Jessica Reynolds. I am 42 years old, and until 6 months before that morning in the federal courthouse in Alexandria, Virginia, my brother and I had not spent more than an hour in the same room since our mother's funeral. That morning he stood in front of the jury box in a suit that cost more than most people's monthly mortgage payments and told them I had been absent for most of my adult life, that my family had never met a commanding officer, never seen a single photograph of me in uniform, that I had told people for years that I worked for the government without ever clarifying what that meant. He told them that after our father died, my name appeared in a sealed appendix to his trust, an appendix authorizing the transfer of more than $800,000 out of the estate just 3 days before he passed. He wanted the jury to draw a straight line between my silence and my guilt. He believed, correctly, that almost none of my service record existed anywhere he could access it. What he had not paused to consider was why the story that jury was hearing had actually started 6 months earlier, on a gray afternoon at Fort Belvoir when my phone rang during a briefing, and a voice I didn't recognize told me my father was gone. I was on a return flight to Virginia within the day. Daniel met me at the house where we grew up, and rather than asking how I was doing, he looked at his watch and said I had made it just in time for the will reading. Convenient. He said, at the reading, our father's attorney explained that Daniel and I were co-beneficiaries of the trust, but that Daniel had been granted temporary control as executor. There was a clause buried in the trust language that I noticed immediately, vague by design, referencing what our father had called service duty known to Robert Reynolds. Daniel laughed out loud when it was read aloud. He called me a paper pusher for the government and dismissed the clause entirely. I said nothing, because I understood in that moment exactly what my father had constructed. He had written the language, deliberately imprecise, protecting the portions of my record that were not mine to disclose while leaving an opening for the day someone tried to weaponize my silence against me. He had known that day was coming. He had known it would arrive in the shape of Daniel. Within weeks, Daniel filed suit. The complaint accused me of fabricating my service record, manipulating a dying man, embezzling trust funds, and forging the signature on the appendix that authorized the Sentinel transfer. Reading it, I felt something harden in my chest that had nothing to do with anger. It had to do with recognition. This was not really about money. Money was only the scaffolding. I called my attorney Eleanor Price, a former JAG lawyer with 30 years of reading exactly this category of case, written in the lines of her face. I told her what I was beginning to understand. He doesn't just want the estate, I said. He wants to erase who I am. Eleanor had already read the filing twice before I called. She told me to let him talk, let him say everything he wanted to say, on the record, under oath, before we showed anyone a single piece of the truth. Every instinct I had trained into myself across 2 decades of service told me to correct the record immediately, to shut the accusation down before it metastasized through our extended family and our father's old community. Eleanor shook her head with the patience of someone who already knew where this was going. If I corrected him too early, she explained, he would adjust the lie. But if I let him commit to it fully, in depositions, on the stand in front of a jury under oath, there would be no version of it he could later soften or reframe. He would be building his case brick by brick on top of something that couldn't hold weight. And when it gave way, he would have no one to blame but the man who laid every single course. To understand why Daniel stood in that courtroom so certain of himself, you need to understand the house we grew up in and the 2 very different people who came out of it. He had always been the one people noticed first. Football captain in high school, easy confidence that filled rooms without effort, a business school degree that generated a reliable stream of dinner table announcements across years of holidays, when he got into trouble, and he did with some regularity. Our mother had always been the first to explain it away in the particular tone of someone who has confused protection with love. I was the quieter one. I ran with my father before sunrise. I learned to read topographic maps at the kitchen table. I fixed the old Jeep in the garage instead of going to parties. After our mother died of cancer when I was 17, something between my father and me shifted into a kind of wordless understanding. Not traumatic, not performed, just to people who knew how to be in the same room with hard things without requiring them to be spoken. When I told the family I had enrolled in our OTC, Daniel did not hide his opinion. He said I would not last 3 months, that I hated being told what to do. I didn't argue with him. I finished the program, received my commission, and began a career that would take me further from that house than either of us had anticipated. For most of the years that followed, I could tell my family very little about where I actually was. I told them I handled logistics analysis for the Department of Defense, which was accurate in the way that a locked door is technically a wall, true enough, but built to keep people out for reasons that mattered. Daniel decided early that this meant I had a desk job, and he returned to that conclusion at every possible opportunity, commenting on my modest salary at family gatherings, asking when I was going to get a real house, treating my itinerant and largely unexplained life as evidence of a lesser path than his own. Our father never made that mistake. He had been an officer long enough to recognize the shape of the gaps in what I told him. One evening after I came home from an assignment that had lasted longer than anyone wanted to acknowledge, he saw the scar on my shoulder while I was reaching for a coffee mug. He didn't ask where it came from. He simply said that he didn't need me to tell him. He only needed to know whether I had brought my people home. I told him not all of them. That was the first time he had embraced me since I became an adult. I remember the smell of his sweater and the stiffness in his arms. The manner of a man not accustomed to the gesture, but unwilling to let the moment pass without it. Years later, Daniel made a series of increasingly poor real estate investments, borrowed heavily against properties he did not fully own, and quietly used our father's name to co-sign several loans without asking permission. When our father discovered it, he removed Daniel from direct control of a portion of the family assets. Daniel concluded without any evidence that I had orchestrated this removal. The truth was that I had not been consulted, had not been in the country when it happened, and did not learn about any of it until after the funeral. But Daniel needed someone to blame, and I was conveniently absent in real time and unable to defend myself in the rooms where he was, telling his version of events. So he started talking to cousins, to old family friends, to anyone at a holiday table willing to listen. Each version of his story became slightly more specific and slightly more convincing, because no one ever contradicted him. I couldn't. Most of what I would have needed to say was classified, and even the parts that weren't felt like handing him material he would only shape into something worse. My silence, which I had always understood as a discipline I was proud of, became the precise instrument he needed during discovery. Eleanor uncovered the fact that Daniel had hired a private investigator months before filing suit, specifically to search for my military record. The investigator found almost nothing. No public deployment records, no ceremony photographs, no news coverage, no visible commendations. To someone already committed to a conclusion, an absence of evidence had looked exactly like evidence of absence. I read the report Eleanor obtained and felt something close to grim amusement. He could not find my file, so he had decided I did not exist. Eleanor looked at me across the table with the expression she reserved for moments when she already knew the ending. That, she said, was going to be the most expensive mistake of his life. Daniel had also submitted bank records during discovery showing the $800,000 transfer to an organization called the Sentinel Recovery Foundation, which he told the jury was a shell entity I secretly controlled. I said nothing in front of him about what Sentinel actually was, a foundation supporting the families of service members killed during an operation I had been part of years earlier. Its recipient list kept confidential to protect the safety and identity of those families. My father had chosen to fund it after learning that some of the people I had served alongside had not received the support they needed when they came home. He had never told me he was going to do it. I only learned about the transfer from the records themselves. The electronic signature authorizing it bore my name. Eleanor's face changed when she saw it. I told her flatly that I had not signed anything. She believed me. A forensic analyst traced the digital signature to the computer in my father's home office, logged in through a secondary account that had been issued to Daniel years earlier, when he was managing our father's medical billing during a hospitalization. The shape of what Daniel had actually done became visible slowly. He had not stolen from Sentinel. He had moved the $800,000 in, then submitted falsified paperwork claiming the transfer was an error and requesting a refund. The returned funds were then distributed across 3 limited liability companies, all of which traced back to Daniel as sole owner. What he had not accounted for was that Sentinel operated under Department of Defense audit standards. Every transaction was time-stamped and cross-referenced in ways that a man accustomed to moving money through private real estate deals had simply never encountered before. I found Martha Cole through my father's home health agency. She had been his nurse for the final 8 months of his life, and she met me at a diner outside Alexandria, choosing a booth in the back and keeping her voice low. She told me Daniel had come by most evenings during those months, and that the visits had rarely resembled a son offering comfort. He came with folders. He pressed my father to sign documents, and when my father refused or asked too many questions, Daniel's voice would escalate until Martha found a reason to step back into the room. She had started quietly recording some of these exchanges, concerned about what she was observing. She played one recording for me on her phone, her hand slightly and steady as she pressed play. Daniel's voice came through first, sharp and impatient, telling our father that if he left the house to me, Daniel would prove I was a fraud, that nobody knew what I had actually been doing for 20 years. My father's response was slower and weaker than I had ever heard his voice, but it was precise. He said I stayed quiet because I had sworn an oath to stay quiet. He told Daniel that Daniel talked too much because he had never had anything worth protecting. I sat with that for a long time after Martha left. Eleanor filed a motion requesting that the court accept sealed documentation from the Department of Defense. The Pentagon agreed to release a limited confirmation, enough to establish service record and rank without exposing missions, locations, or the identities of anyone I had served with. Daniel had no awareness that any of this was in motion, as far as he knew. The silence from my side of the courtroom meant I was losing ground, confident enough in that assessment to host a family dinner and announce to relatives that he expected to win the house outright and force me to cover his legal costs. He told the table that after the trial he intended to push for an investigation into me for impersonating a service member, and asked me directly whether I had really served. My father knew the truth, I said. Daniel laughed. He said our father was dead and couldn't save me anymore. I looked at my brother across that table, at the ease sitting on his face, and felt something settle inside me rather than break. I told him he was right. Our father couldn't save me. What I didn't say out loud was what I thought clearly enough to feel. He didn't need to. He had already left me everything I needed to save myself. The morning the Pentagon documentation was introduced, Daniel had invited reporters to the courthouse steps, expecting to watch me exposed. A major general entered the courtroom, authorized by the Department of Defense to appear on record, and the judge read aloud the confirmed elements of my file. More than 20 years of continuous service, the rank of lieutenant colonel, command positions within a unit supporting special operations, classification restrictions existing for legitimate and long-standing security reasons, the Silver Star, awarded for actions during a rescue operation, and a formal statement that my refusal to disclose mission details had never constituted deception of any kind. It had been a binding legal obligation I had honored exactly as required. Eleanor then presented the financial evidence without interruption. The login records tied to Daniel's credentials, the falsified refund request, the LLCs he solely owned, the trust appendix he had altered, and the sworn deposition in which he had denied every single piece of it under oath. Finally, the court received the blue appendix my father had sent to the Pentagon for safekeeping before he died, the one Daniel had removed from the safe deposit box believing no copy existed. In it, my father had written that I had taken nothing from him, that the Sentinel transfer was a gift he gave willingly, in memory of those who had not come home with his daughter. He had added one final line, which Eleanor read aloud to the entire room, that if Daniel ever attempted to use my service to humiliate me, all trust authority currently held by Daniel was to be terminated immediately. The jury rejected every claim Daniel had brought. The court transferred the family home to me, ordered Daniel to cover the majority of legal costs, and referred the full record to federal prosecutors. Daniel eventually accepted a plea agreement that required full financial restitution, the sale of his vacation property and financed vehicle, federal supervision, and a public acknowledgement that he had knowingly provided false testimony under oath. He called me once after the plea was finalized. He said I had destroyed his life. I told him I had not logged into our father's accounts. I had not forged any documents. I had not lied to a jury. I had simply stopped protecting him from the consequences of what he had done himself. He asked why I hadn't proven who I was on the first day, and ended the whole thing in a single afternoon. Because, I told him, if I had shown my hand immediately, he would have adjusted his story. I needed him to say every lie out loud while he still believed I had nothing to answer with. There was a long silence on the line before he hung up. I did not call him again. I moved back into my father's house and turned his old study into an office for a support program I started for veterans and military families, navigating exactly the kind of legal and financial fights I had just survived. On one of the last afternoons before the house officially became mine on paper, I found myself in the garage looking at the old Jeep we used to work on together. On the driver's seat was a small envelope in my father's handwriting. He had written one sentence: "You don't have to prove who you are to the people who love you, but never let a liar define you to the rest of the world." I folded the letter and stood there in the quiet of that couch and breathed in the smell of old motor oil and dust. And what I felt was not triumph. It was the particular relief of knowing that the names of the people I had served with, the ones who never came home, were no longer going to be used as props in someone else's fabrication. My brother walked into that courtroom believing my silence was the same as having nothing. He was wrong. My silence was never weakness. It was simply the time I gave him to talk himself into a verdict he could not walk back from. And in the end, it wasn't the courtroom that proved who I was. It was the truth, patient and steady, doing exactly what the truth does when you stop rushing it and let it arrive on its own terms.